It provides a cultural opportunity for students as well as the community to explore the rich heritage of St. Bernard and the New Orleans area. As Nunez Community College and Penn TV presents the Nunez History Lecture Series.
Hi, I'm Marty Morgan, research historian at the National D-Day Museum, and we are presenting this today in connection with the Nunez Community College's History Lecture Series. Today I'm going to be talking to you about U-boat operations in the Gulf of Mexico. Most people aren't aware of it, but during the Second World War, German submarines, German U-boats. U-boat stands for Unterseeboot, which in German translates into English as basically underwater boat, submarine. But German U-boats operated within the confines of the Gulf of Mexico. Over the course of about a 14-month period of time, 24 different U-boats operated in the Gulf of Mexico, during which time they sank 56 ships, damaged 16 others. In response to this, the United States only managed to sink 3 U-boats. The U-boat campaign in the Gulf of Mexico was very destructive for the United States and for our allies, because in the Gulf of Mexico, not just American ships were sunk, but ships for our allies, such as the Soviet Union, Mexico, and England. Their ships were sunk in the Gulf of Mexico as well. Now, some of these sinkings took place far out in the middle of the Gulf, far away from land, but some of them also took place very, very close to land. For example, July 9th, 1942, the sinking of the SS Benjamin Brewster. Benjamin Brewster had anchored overnight 1 mile off of Grand Isle, Louisiana. One of the torpedoes that was fired at Benjamin Brewster hit the ship and set it on fire, but one of the other torpedoes managed to plow itself up on the beach at Grand Isle. That's how close the enemy was, and most people don't realize it, but during the Second World War, Louisiana was a battlefield just like Northwest Europe or Southeast Asia. Well, moving on. Fort Jefferson and the Dry Tortugas. Fort Jefferson was built by the United States government beginning in the 1840s, completed, well, it wasn't really actually completed. It was under construction throughout the American Civil War. It was still being built in the 1870s until the United States finally just walked away from the construction project. It was largely abandoned toward the end of the 19th century, and in the beginning of the 20th century, people began to go to Fort Jefferson to visit it as sort of an historic attraction, as an historic site. The National Park Service absorbed it in 1935, and Harry S. Truman designated it a National Historic Monument. During World War II, there was one man living in this fortification with his wife. His name was Robert Budlong, and he was the superintendent of the Fort Jefferson National Historic Site. Well, Robert Budlong lived here during the month of May 42. And in May 1942, the Germans sank more ships in the Gulf of Mexico than they did anywhere else on Earth for any 1 month period of time during the entire duration of the Second World War. So, during May 1942, the Gulf of Mexico was the most dangerous place on Earth for any ship. Robert Budlong was living here in the Dry Tortugas during that period of time. Fort Jefferson is in a small island group called the Dry Tortugas. It's 80 miles west of Key West, Florida. Now, as the German submarines entered the Gulf of Mexico, they would pass very close to this fortification. Many of the sinkings occurred within sight of Fort Jefferson. Robert Budlong, in connection with his responsibilities as a superintendent of a national park, he had to turn in a monthly narrative report for every month that he worked. And in his monthly narrative reports, he would comment on things like the wildlife, he would comment on things like the condition of the fort, but then he would also comment on other circumstances, like the number of visitors coming to the site, and anything else he felt like mentioning in his report. In his report for May 1942, which he submitted in June of 42, the following month, he said no private yachts visited the monument, the fort, during the month of May 1942. The Gulf has an evil reputation these days. And what Budlong was talking about was the fact that German U-boats were patrolling and hunting in the waters immediately around this fortification and in the rest of the Gulf of Mexico. The very first U-boat to enter the Gulf of Mexico was U-507. It enters the Gulf on May 1st, 1942, and its commanding officer was Korvettenkapitan, which was basically like captain. His name was Otto Schucht, and Captain Schucht, as his U-boat entered the Gulf of Mexico on the surface at night during dark hours, they sailed within a mile of Fort Jefferson. And Fort Jefferson has a lighthouse. You can see it in this 1930s postcard. As Captain Schucht entered U-507 through the Straits of Florida within sight of Fort Jefferson, he entered in his logbook, entering the Dry Tortugas, or entering the Straits of Florida near the Dry Tortugas. Will pass through on my way to my operating station off the mouth of the Mississippi River. And then he added one last line. He said, the Dry Tortuga's light burns as if it were peacetime. What the Germans faced in their campaign in the Gulf of Mexico was a United States that was not just unready. It was a United States that wasn't in a position to take on an enemy in the Gulf of Mexico, but an enemy that would hunt at night during the daytime. And in response to this, the United States did little in the way of precaution to limit the amount of damage. For example, the lighthouse at Dry Tortugas, a navigational beacon, was still burning. And so as the first U-boat enters the Gulf of Mexico, the captain uses that lighthouse uses it to navigate his way in and find his way into the wide open waters of the Gulf of Mexico. The area defining the Gulf of Mexico is what we traditionally understand to be between Florida, Louisiana, Texas, and the Yucatan Peninsula, but it also included areas down in this corner here of the Caribbean, and then some parts of the Atlantic coast of Florida. This is what the Gulf of Mexico looked like before the Germans came in. After the German U-boats operated in the Gulf, it looked like that. They attacked over 100 different ships over the course of a 14-month period of time, and in that they managed to sink 56 of those ships. Some of those ships were only damaged. There were some cases where the Germans attacked a ship and did no damage. They missed them altogether with their torpedoes. But out of 116 different attacks, the Germans sank 56 ships and damaged 16 others. And in response for that, the United States only manages to sink 3 U-boats. You can see them there. U-176, which was actually sunk by the Cuban Navy in connection with the United States Navy. The U-157 near the Straits of Florida, and then finally U-166, which was discovered in May of 2001, just about 45 miles off of the mouth of the Mississippi River. I'll be talking about that in more detail later on. And just to give you an appreciation for the amount of damage that the Germans did, look at the number of U-boats sunk compared to the number of ships attacked. They sink 56 of ours, we sink 3 of theirs. The Germans crossed the Atlantic Ocean and defeated us in our own backyard during World War II. Throughout the summer of '42, scenes like this were common. Ships of all makes and models being sunk. They were tankers, they were freighters, they were carrying everything from crude oil to bananas, and the Germans were sinking them. In some cases, they would sail off the mouth of the Mississippi River, sail 2 miles, and get sunk right there within sight of land. Many of these ships suffered casualties. Some ships were complete losses, never heard from again. No one knows what the fate is. We only know what happened to the ship because of what was entered in the U-boat's logbook later. So scenes like this were very, very common throughout the summer of 1942. For example, this one. This was the SS Pennsylvania Sun that was torpedoed by U-571 in July of '42. And then, like I mentioned earlier, in connection with the sinking of the SS Benjamin Brewster off of Grand Isle, Louisiana, one of the torpedoes missed the ship and drove itself up onto the beach at Grand Isle, where these Coast Guardsmen and Navymen posed with this picture. What they didn't realize was how deadly this could be. There was one case where the same thing happened at Barbados, at Bermuda. No, it was Barbados. Happened in Barbados, where a torpedo plowed itself up onto the beach and didn't explode, and some men gathered around it for a photograph like this. One of them accidentally hit one of the pressure-sensitive trigger devices on the end of the torpedo and set off 1,200 pounds of high explosive and killed all 4 men standing there. So that didn't happen in this case, luckily, because they stayed away from the trigger devices on the end of the torpedo. During this period of time, the United States, like I mentioned earlier, was terribly unprepared. We didn't black out our coastline. We didn't make the lighthouses stop shining at night. All we had to meet the Germans when they first came into the Gulf of Mexico were squadrons of unarmed reconnaissance aircraft. One of those squadrons was based here in New Orleans and flew out of Lakefront Airport. It was the 122nd Observation Squadron. It flew as part of the Louisiana National Guard, and it flew the old Douglas O-46. It used to be a biplane. They eliminated the lower wing of the aircraft and turned it into an observation plane. No weapons, simply observation. They then upgraded to the hot rod, comparatively, the O-47, yet another slow, unarmed observation aircraft. From Key West, Florida, to Corpus Christi, Texas, the entire American coastline on the Gulf of Mexico, there were about 300 operational military aircraft. Out of that 300, less than 20 of them could carry a gun. Most of them were unarmed observation aircraft or training aircraft, like the training aircraft at Pensacola, where the Navy conducted primary flight training. So the United States had a serious lack of military aircraft that could actually bring war to U-boats operating in the Gulf of Mexico. In fact, when the Germans started coming into the Gulf of Mexico, the most frequent reports didn't come from military observation aircraft. In other words, the most frequent sighting reports didn't come from members of the 122nd Observation Squadron. The most frequent sighting reports came from commercial airline pilots, men that were making the final approach to the landing strip at Miami or New Orleans or Houston, flying over the Gulf of Mexico. They'd look out of their windows and they'd see a submarine cruising on the surface, arrogantly, not fearing for anything because the United States could largely do nothing about them. They would call in these sightings. They'd say, Delta flight, whatever, inbound to Miami. We've spotted a U-boat on the surface 10 miles off the coast of Key Largo, Florida. And those reports would make their way to the military, and by the time the military responded, it was too late because the U-boat had long since gone. Well, I wanted to talk to you briefly about a few of the U-boats that operated in the Gulf of Mexico. First of all, one of the more successful U-boats was U-67. U-67 enters the Gulf of Mexico. I said 67, I meant 87, excuse me. It enters the Gulf of Mexico in June, sinks ships throughout June and into July, and conducts a very successful operation. It enters, as the early U-boats did, through the Straits of Florida, here, between the Florida Keys and Cuba. Now, that was a very difficult way for a U-boat to get into the Gulf of Mexico because of the current that flowed through there. The current tends to cycle in a counterclockwise direction, and then it heads out. In other words, it heads to the east, to the Straits of Florida. Now, U-boats were very effective insofar as they could dive beneath the water, and no one can see them. However, when they were underwater, they were at a significant disadvantage in terms of mobility. A U-boat cruising on the surface with its diesel engines could go 20 miles an hour. A U-boat underwater operating on its electric engines could go maybe 5 or 6 miles an hour. That was all. Very, very slow. The current flowing through the Straits of Florida in this direction was usually 5 or 6 miles an hour. So U-boats couldn't enter the Gulf of Mexico submerged through the Straits of Florida because the current would be pushing them backwards even when they were at full speed. The only way for them to enter was to enter on the surface at night when they couldn't be spotted. They would get on the surface, run on their diesel engines at 20 miles an hour, and they'd move straight on into the Gulf of Mexico. The early U-boats would do that and come in on the surface at night through the Straits of Florida. They would later learn a better way into the Gulf of Mexico, but we'll get to that in a moment. U-87 starts coming, U-87, excuse me, starts coming into the Gulf of Mexico and begins sinking ships. It sinks its first ship on June 15th and continues terrorizing ships in the Gulf throughout the rest of the month and into July. One of the first ships that it sinks is the SS Raleigh Warner. U-87 sinks it in June 1942, and Raleigh Warner, 322 feet long, launched in October of 1912, 3,000-ton tanker. It was torpedoed, and at the time it was torpedoed, it had 29 men on board. There were no survivors. And then it also cruised over to the west on the coast of Florida on the Gulf, just off of Apalachicola Bay, Florida, where it sat and waited for any target that came down the Apalachicola River. The Apalachicola River, when it crosses the border into Georgia, it becomes the Chattahoochee River, and it's a big, wide, navigable river, and big ships could get on that river and haul things like lumber out of there. And so in June, on June 29, 1942, this nice big target, a huge ship called the SS Empire Mico, which was actually a British ship, comes off of the mouth of the river, of the Apalachicola River, passes into Apalachicola Bay, passes the barrier islands, moves out into the Gulf, and gets torpedoed there in sight of land. The U-boat then surfaced, and one of the U-boat crewmen took this photograph. So you can see the backs of the heads of some of the crew of the U-boat as it surfaced so that the crew could watch the Empire Mico as it sank. But then the same U-boat sinks SS Benjamin Brewster off of Grand Isle, Louisiana. Nice big ship, a big tanker. It weighed 5,950 tons, huge tanker. And it was carrying a cargo that was of considerable danger. It was carrying 150,000 barrels of 101 octane aviation gasoline. When the torpedo hit Benjamin Brewster, it lit up like a torch and burned for 10 days. It was in relatively shallow water of only about 30-foot depth, so when the torpedo hit it and it burst into flames, it settled but didn't sink completely beneath the waves, and so the Benjamin Brewster, with some of its wreckage still sticking up above the surface, continued to burn and burn and burn. These photographs were taken of it from onshore at Grand Isle. You can see the ship was very, very close to shore. And then someone took a boat out to it to get in closer, and you can see some of the wreckage there. It burned so fiercely over such a long period of time and produced so much heat that people couldn't get close to it for the first few days. As the fires began to die down and they moved in close, they found that that heat had caused most of the superstructure that was above the water to melt. That's how intense the heat was. Now, one of the other U-boats to operate in the Gulf of Mexico was U-171. I'm just giving you samplings. There were 24 different boats that operated in the Gulf. I just wanted to hit a couple because we don't have enough time to talk about all of them. But U-171 enters using a method that other U-boats would use later in the campaign. Rather than entering through the Straits of Florida, where you have a heavy, heavy current, a current that works against you, they could enter through the Yucatan Channel, here between the western tip of Cuba and the Yucatan Peninsula, where the current tended to pick them up and carry them along. They could enter submerged or on the surface, and the current would carry them in this direction on the Gulf of Mexico and would usually carry them straight up to here at the mouth of the Mississippi River, which was their target. When the U-boats started coming into the Gulf of Mexico, it wasn't because they wanted to sink ships way out in the middle of the Gulf. It wasn't because they wanted to act against Galveston or Corpus Christi or Pensacola or Tampa. It was because they simply targeted that which was coming off of the Mississippi River, which was the largest, busiest artery carrying shipping in the United States of America at the time. The Germans recognized that this was a valuable target, that if they could cripple the United States by sinking the tankers and the freighters as they came off the Mississippi, the Germans realized that they could score a significant advantage in the war. What the Germans figured, and what they almost did, the Germans figured that if they could sink almost every ship coming off of the Mississippi, they would sink ships faster than we would have the ability to produce them. The Germans were right. The only problem was that the Germans didn't commit enough U-boats, and they didn't keep them in the Gulf of Mexico. They operated in the Gulf of Mexico for 14 months, but really it was only during 4 months that the Germans had a large commitment where they had, at one time, they had 10 boats in the Gulf of Mexico simultaneously. Now, after June, July, August 1942, it wasn't like that. The high point was in May 42. And then after that, it tapered off to August. And then after August, the entire campaign fell off to barely a trickle. But during May, June, July, August 1942, the Germans had as many as 10 boats in the Gulf at one time, and that's when they did their most damage. Now, U-171 entered the Gulf of Mexico through the Yucatan Channel. It was attacked by this aircraft on August 1st, 1942, which actually plays into the story rather importantly. This aircraft, U.S. Coast Guard J-4F Widgeon, it flew out of Houma, Louisiana. It was a U.S. Coast Guard aircraft. And the pilot and co-pilot took off out of Houma in the morning on August 1st, 42. They flew 50 miles south, straight out over Terrebonne Bay, out over Ile Dernier, or the last island as it translates into English, flew out past Ship Shoal, which is a series of the shoal water area that's just south of the coast there, and spotted a U-boat on the surface. The aircraft was carrying one 325-pound depth charge. Depth charge is like a bomb that explodes underwater, and flew in as the U-boat was diving, dropped this depth charge, set it off. For a long time, we thought that aircraft sank U-166, but in May 2001, we found that that was not the case. We now know that this aircraft, which, by the way, is on display just about 150 miles, now 200 miles from here, in Pensacola, Florida, at the National Museum of Naval Aviation, this aircraft, we now know it attacked U-171, which was one of the other boats that was in the Gulf of Mexico. U-171 sank the SSR M. Parker Jr., which was a large freighter. And now we wanted to talk about U-166. 166 was launched in March of 1942. It was a German Type 9C U-boat, 250 feet long, weighing about 20 tons. It had a crew of 52. The oldest person on board the U-boat was the captain, who was an old man at 29 years of age. Most of the crew, 18, 19-year-old German boys. And they launched the U-boat, trained briefly in the Baltic at a place called Stettin, and then moved to occupied France on the Bay of Biscay to a place called Lorient, which was their operating base. The U-boat then went on its first and only war cruise. It left Lorient in occupied France in early June of 1942, crossed the Atlantic Ocean, entered the Gulf of Mexico through the Yucatan Channel, and began operating against shipping. On its way into the Gulf, it hit a couple of targets. It hit a sailing yacht off the screen, off the far eastern coast of Cuba, and then it sank another ship, a large ship called the Oneida, on its way in. It entered the Gulf through the Yucatan Channel and intercepted another ship here in the middle of the Straits of Florida, the merchant ship Gertrude. Well, it's actually a commercial fishing trawler. The Gertrude was a 16-ton trawler. It was really about the same size as the larger shrimp boats that you see in the area. When U-166 intercepted the trawler Gertrude, it caught it on the surface, made them stop, and then sank it using its deck gun. U-boats at that time had a 105 millimeter gun on the forward deck, and then they also could sink ships using torpedoes. The torpedoes were expensive, and the German U-boats could only carry about 20 torpedoes on one boatload. So they preferred to sink ships with their deck gun. It was a lot cheaper, and they could carry a heck of a lot more ammunition for the deck gun than they could carry torpedoes. So U-166 causes the trawler Gertrude to stop on the surface. They allow the captain and his two mates to get off the ship into a lifeboat and row away, and then using the deck gun, they sink it. The funny thing is what Gertrude was carrying. Now, early in the campaign, in May and in June, the Germans were sinking tankers that were carrying crude oil. They were sinking iron ore freighters that were carrying bauxite. They were carrying things that were of strategic importance. However, later in the war, later in the campaign, in July of 42, just a few weeks later, the merchant ship fleet that was operating in the Gulf had largely reacted and was no longer sailing at night. They were no longer sailing one by one, sailing out alone into the Gulf of Mexico. And so the big targets were no longer as easy to find as they had been 2 or 3 months earlier. So U-166 comes into the Gulf and it intercepts and sinks the trawler Gertrude, a little 16-ton rinky-dink ship that was carrying something that was not at all of any importance to the war effort, basically. The trawler Gertrude was carrying 40,000 pounds of onions. The Germans stopped it and sank it, and that was because that's all they could find. The big targets were no longer as abundant as they had been earlier in the summer. But U-166 ultimately did find a nice, big, fat, juicy target, but that was just a little while later. Well, anyway, the first ship that it sank was the 2,309-ton freighter Oneida, which it encountered on the way into the Gulf of Mexico just off of the Cuban coast. And then, on July 30th, 1942, U-166 encounters the 5,000-ton passenger freighter SS Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee had 407 people on board. It could carry passengers, and in fact, it was a pre-war passenger ship. It was like a tour ship. The former cruise ship had been impressed into military service during the war. This was its paint job before World War II, where it was black and it was white. It had bright deck awnings. During the war, they subdued its paint job to the photographs, to the coloration you see there. This is a photograph of it making its way down the Mississippi River, incidentally, just off New Orleans in January of 42. After it was impressed into military service, the U.S. military painted it a dull deep-sea gray and put one deck gun on the stern of the ship. Just in the event that a U-boat surfaced and began to chase it, it would at least have a gun to fight back with so that it wasn't completely unarmed. Well, what they didn't count on was a U-boat that would sink it with a torpedo while the U-boat was still underwater. And that's exactly what happened. It was a clear day. The survivors have told me that the water was absolutely calm. Robert E. Lee was making its way at about 25 knots, which is pretty fast for a 5,000-tonner, and it was approaching the mouth of the Mississippi River. In fact, the radio operator was just making a call to the harbor pilots at the mouth of the Mississippi River at a place called Burwood, and they were saying, we're inbound, we'll be there in 2 hours, please have a harbor pilot ready to bring us into the river. Well, as they were making their way, suddenly some of the passengers noticed something trailing along on the starboard side of the ship. They thought it was a porpoise at first, and then suddenly it turned in toward the ship and struck starboard side amidship. Huge explosion of a German G-7E torpedo carrying 1,200 pounds of high explosive. The explosion blew a gaping hole underneath the waterline, below the waterline, that flooded the engine room, put out all of the fires in the boilers of the engines that were making the ship move. The ship took on water quickly and then began to settle. As it began to settle, it listed first of all to the starboard side. All 407 people on board scrambled up onto the deck. They launched as many lifeboats as they could. They only got about 6 lifeboats away, and then they threw some life rafts into the water too. Some people got down calmly into lifeboats and rowed away. Some people had to dive overboard into the water. It was no big deal because this is late July 1942 in the Gulf of Mexico. The water was warm. It was 100 degrees out that day. The temperature wasn't the problem. The problem was this 5,000-ton ship that was sinking quickly. Some of the survivors estimated that it took 10 minutes for the ship to sink. There was a ship sailing with it that estimated that it took 5 minutes for this 5,000-ton ship carrying 400 people to disappear beneath the water. Well, it just so happened that Robert E. Lee was not sailing alone. Robert E. Lee was in escort with another ship. And let's get to this. There we go. Let's talk about that. Robert E. Lee was in escort with the U.S. patrol craft called PC-566. PC-566 was sailing as convoy escort. It was escorting Robert E. Lee, and this was a warship. PC-566 was about 1.5 miles ahead of Robert E. Lee when the torpedo hit. As soon as the torpedo hit, PC-566 turned around and charged back into the area at full speed. Now, the U-boat, we believe, probably did not know that the PC was there, the patrol craft was there, because the U-boat was still close to the surface watching Robert E. Lee sink. We know that because one of the watchmen on board PC-566, looking through binoculars, spotted a periscope above the water. They immediately steered toward that periscope at high speed. They were bearing down on this periscope above the water when suddenly the periscope turned around and looked at the PC and disappeared. Now, when the periscope was finally pulled back down beneath the water, the patrol craft was only about 200 yards away. What we think happened was that the U-boat didn't know the patrol craft was approaching and figured it out because they could hear the sound of its engines coming. They turned around, spotted it. Immediately the captain ordered a dive. U-166 was diving. In fact, the wake that had been left by the periscope above the water was still visible when PC-566 rolled over it. PC-566 launched 5 depth charges. Now, a depth charge, I mentioned it earlier. This is a type of bomb that when it hits the water, carries high explosive. It hits the water, it will sink to a certain depth and then explode. The way that a depth charge is deadly and destructive against a submarine is that it creates a shock wave, and a shock wave can have enough force to rupture the hull of a submarine underwater. What they ideally would do in a perfectly conducted depth charge attack was to drop one depth charge on one side of the submarine, one depth charge on the other. The 2 depth charges exploding simultaneously would send shock waves coming from 2 different directions into the submarine and either crush the submarine or rip it in half. Well, PC-566 charges in, drops off its first 5 depth charges. It then moves out and about 1,000 yards away from the target area. The depth charges all exploded in the water. It turned around, came back in and conducted a second attack, dropped another 5 depth charges over the side on the diving U-boat. Well, what we think happened is that as U-166 was diving to get away, PC-566 went right over it, and one of those depth charges sank down and landed on the deck. U-166 was only about 50 feet deep when it was diving. We think it was only between 50 and 70 feet deep when that depth charge sank down and landed on the deck. We now know for a fact that the depth charges were set to explode at 150, 200, and 250 feet. So what we think happened is that that depth charge rode down as the U-boat was diving from 70 feet to 100 feet, and it probably stayed on deck until that U-boat crossed 150 feet, and then it exploded. That explosion was fatal for U-166. It destroyed U-166. The explosion sank the U-boat, killed the entire crew. But we'll get back to that in a second. What was happening on the surface, though, was very, very dramatic. 407 survivors in the water, and those people had to be rescued. PC-566, after conducting its after its depth charge attack, it came in and took on as many survivors as it could. But PC-566 was a very, very small boat. They could only take about 100 people on board. There were still over 300 people in the water, some of them in lifeboats, some of them not in lifeboats. They put a call in, an emergency call in to Burwood, Louisiana, which is on the southwest pass of the Mississippi River, and a few boats came down to help in the rescue effort. One of those boats was a subchaser called SC-519, a very, very small subchaser craft. It picked some people up out of the water, but then also The tug Underwriter came down from Burwood. It was operated by the Mississippi River Harbor Pilots Association. It came in and it pulled survivors out of the water as well. Those survivors were then taken up to inland, transferred by bus to New Orleans, where some of them were treated for injuries. 407 people went into the water when Robert E. Lee sank, and 25 of them died as a result of it. Well, like I mentioned a second ago, PC-566 destroyed U-166, killing 52 German sailors. The rescue boats were from Burwood, Louisiana. This is a photograph of Burwood on the Southwest Pass from April 1942. And there's another shot. There's a shot, in fact, of the pier area with 2 sub-chasers and a patrol craft in port. That is actually PC-566 there in that photo. But as I mentioned, the depth charge attack was successful, and U-166 was sunk then and there. Fast forward to the year 2000, year 2000, 60 years later, just about 60 years later, BP and Shell oil companies were conducting an oil and gas survey of a particularly deep area of the Gulf of Mexico as they were about to lay a natural gas pipeline out to a deep water pipeline field. They were conducting their survey using this device, a high-tech, autonomously operated underwater vehicle called Hugin 3000. And Hugin had the ability, it was basically a remote control underwater vehicle that carried high-detail multi-beam sonar that would sweep back and forth over an area on the bottom of the ocean and take in sonar readings as they were about to lay this pipeline. It was obviously very important to BP and Shell for this multi-million-dollar pipeline effort that they know exactly what type of terrain they're laying the pipeline across. So this device, the AUV, is moving back and forth conducting this survey of the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico when it takes that reading right there. That's actually not a photograph, but what you're looking at there is sound. That's a sonar image of an obvious wreck site that the AUV detected. That sonar image was taken to a few people that know about such things and was identified as being the wreckage of U-166. They also detected a wreck site very close by. Less than a mile away from this wreckage on the bottom of the Gulf was another wreck, the Robert E. Lee. Now, after they detected these wreck sites, interesting thing about the wreckage of Robert E. Lee, it's largely intact, but then you'll notice right here, where the arrow's pointing to it, lifeboats that landed on the bottom within 200 yards of the wreckage of Robert E. Lee. Well, after the 2 wreck sites were detected, Shell and BP paid for an expedition out to the wreck site using a remotely operated vehicle, and the remotely operated vehicle could dive all the way down to the wreck sites, equipped with video cameras and still cameras, and could survey and document the wreck sites. So, immediately thereafter, this was in May of 2001, this remotely operated vehicle dove on the wreck of U-166 and collected these series of photographs. What you see in this photograph is some of the forward deck area, and if you'll notice here, it's supposed to be all flat, but in this area here, there's a great deal of compression, and then beyond that, an incredible amount of damage, tangled wreckage. We believe that was caused by that depth charge that landed on deck and then detonated on deck, directly on the deck of the U-boat. But then also identifiable in the wreckage were things like the Wintergarten, that's a German word for an area on the conning tower where the crew could go sit, where the lookouts would be on duty, and then also, like, for example, here, where they had an anti-aircraft gun, a 20 millimeter anti-aircraft gun. Also identifiable in the wreckage was the forward 105 millimeter gun on the main deck of the U-boat. Now, all of this wreckage was identified, and it was a very, very exciting time because obviously what had been located was the remains of a U-boat that actually was engaged in combat in the Gulf of Mexico during World War II. A U-boat that had been destroyed, one of only 3 U-boats destroyed in the Gulf of Mexico during World War II. But that excitement was soon followed by something even more exciting that I was directly involved in. I really enjoyed being involved in it. As soon as the discovery was announced publicly, people in Germany got very interested in it. Some surviving family members were interested in it because that was a submarine upon which their relatives had been killed during the war. And a little over a year ago, I was contacted by ZDF Television in Germany, which is the equivalent of PBS in Germany, and they sent over a film crew that wanted to interview survivors and do some research about it. Well, that film crew came over, got to know them very well, and they conducted some interview research, and after they finished and went back to Germany, they continued with their research efforts and managed to locate the surviving family members of the captain of U-166. They interviewed these people and ultimately convinced these people to donate all of the remains of the personal effects of the captain of U-166 to the National D-Day Museum. And so what we ended up receiving just about 6 months ago was an incredibly wealthy collection of photographs and original memorabilia from the captain of the U-boat that included photographs of U-166 before it was destroyed. The captain of U-166 was named Hans Gunther Kuhlmann, and Captain Kuhlmann was born in 1913. He went to the German Naval Academy in Flensburg in northern Germany on the North Sea, and he was appointed captain of he served on one U-boat first, U-37, and then was appointed captain of another U-boat before being given command of U-166. That's a picture of Captain Kuhlmann when he was serving in the German Merchant Marine in the 1930s before he joined the German Navy. The interesting thing about the photograph collection that we were given is that it contained lots of personal photographs too. Photographs of him with one of his early girlfriends there that you see there, him and some of his friends on some leisure time when they were in the Naval Academy. A photograph of him when he was commissioned as a young lieutenant in the German Navy in 1938 before he took command of U-166. And then a photograph of him there when he was serving on his first tour of duty on U-37 in 1940, not long after the war broke out. There he is. You can see him circled up there. He was the first watch officer. In other words, he was the second in command of U-37 in this early phase of his career. After U-37, he was promoted to the rank of Oberleutnant zur See, which is basically like a captain it translates to captain in the U.S. Navy in its rank system. And then he was given command of U-580, and there he is with the crew of U-580 in 1941. There's a bit of a tragic epilogue to the U-580 story. This is his first command. He had served as a crewman on another U-boat. He was then placed in command of this U-boat responsible for the lives of 52 men, and they were in their training phase. They took on U-580, which was a brand new U-boat that had recently been completed, and during a training cruise in 1941, he managed to ram a target ship, a ship that was towing a target. Accidentally rammed it, U-580 sank and killed 10 of the men in this photograph. This is something that during peacetime would have ruined his career. But in 1941, the German military was basically at war with the entire world, and they needed every trained and experienced U-boat captain that they could get their hands on. So this man who had committed this horrible mistake, who probably during peacetime would have seen his career come to an abrupt halt, was given some time off to sort of collect himself and then placed in command of a new U-boat. There's U-580 shortly before its destruction in November 1941. One of the interesting things is that they put into Stettin in the Baltic in October, and of course the Baltic is very, very cold in October, and it snowed one night, and there was a bunch of snow on deck, and so some of the men goofing around on the forward deck built this little snowman, and they put the bowler cap on it that says 580. And the bowler caps are something that the captain and his officers would wear if they went to any sort of formal dinner, and it identified them as the officers of that U-boat. U-580 at sea during 1941 during its early sea trials. Captain Kuhlmann, after the U-580 disaster, went back to Flensburg, which was the site of the German Naval Academy that he had attended, which is where his wife lived, and then he was put in contact with several other officers that would become the basic core of officers for his next U-boat assignment. He had some leave time after the disaster that he spent with his wife, Gertrude, and these other officers and some of their wives and friends. And when you got photographs like this, you can see Captain Kuhlmann is in the white hat. You can always tell the commander of the U-boat because he's the only one in the white hat, with Erwin Klein, with Hans Traun, and with Egon Schmidt. This is Kuhlmann's wife, Gertrude Kuhlmann, who ultimately remarried after her husband was killed, and she kept all of his personal effects, and she died in 1989 and gave those personal effects to her daughter, and that's the woman that donated the material to the D-Day Museum. And then interestingly, this woman, Ursula Traun, who was married to Hans Traun, who was the first watch officer or the second in command of U-166, she's still alive today. At any rate, Kuhlmann enjoyed some downtime. And just to give you an idea of the wealth of photographs in this collection, it even included a wedding portrait. He was given some downtime just to spend a little bit of leisure time to forget about the entire U-580 disaster, and then he was appointed captain of U-166. And his first watch officer, or his second in command, was Hans Traun. And there's a wedding photograph of Hans Traun, interestingly enough, part of the great collection that we now have. But then in March 1942, Kuhlman presided over the commissioning ceremony for the brand new U-boat U-166. This commissioning ceremony was conducted in Bremen, where the U-boat was built, at the Seebeck shipyard. And during the commissioning ceremony, someone happened to be there with Kuhlman's camera taking these photographs, capturing the moment when U-166 became a part of the German Navy. You can see here, Captain Kuhlman is up on the conning tower in the winter garden area of the U-boat as they are about to raise the German flag over the U-boat for the very first time. You can see them saluting, and you can even make out the swastika on the flag. Then someone managed to snap this one photograph of the entire crew of U-166. These men had no idea of knowing that within 18 weeks they would all be dead and at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico. But the commissioning ceremony made for some fantastic photographs. All the men in their dress uniforms. You can tell that it was a cold day. It was March 1942. It's up in Bremen, which is in northern Germany, so it was obviously quite cold. And you can even make out some ice floes in the river behind them. Interesting in this photograph is the 37mm anti-aircraft cannon on the deck. This is the rear deck area, not the front deck area. And you can see the three officers of U-166 there. There again during the commissioning ceremony. And these photographs are of great importance just because of the fact that they captured images of the U-boat before its destruction. Before we found this collection, we thought that no photographs existed of the U-boat, so it was a terrific find. After the commissioning ceremony, they took on supplies. They moved the U-boat to Stettin in occupied Poland for a brief training cruise. During this training cruise, he managed not to destroy the U-boat, as he had U-580. Then they took on more supplies, and they had to deploy to their forward operating base at Lorient in occupied France on the Bay of Biscay. This photograph shows the captain, Hans Kuhlman, with one of his officers on deck taking on supplies. When they left Bremen, they had to sail up the Bremen River through Bremerhaven to a place called Wesermünde, which is on the coast, right up on the coast where the Weser River feeds into the North Sea. And as they sailed up the Weser River, the captain allowed non-essential crew to get up on deck to look at the countryside as they moved down the canal. And as they did that, these photographs were taken. He did this probably so that the men could see Germany. The men were probably, as they were deploying to occupied France, the men were probably thinking, who knows when we'll be back to Germany. It probably won't be anytime soon. What they didn't know was this was the last time they'd ever see Germany. Managed to capture some great images of the boat and capture good shots of the 105mm deck gun. There again, moving up the Weser River toward the North Sea. And then this marking, well, they stopped at one point and took a close photograph of that marking. And on it, it has a diving U-boat and the German national symbol with swastika, the eagle and swastika, and then the word Frontreif, which means ready for the front or combat ready. When the boat was completed by the manufacturer, which was a civilian shipbuilding firm, the German Navy sent an inspector on board. He inspected the U-boat, and when he recognized that the U-boat was ready for service, they would put that seal on the U-boat. And that seal identified the boat as having met all of the challenges associated with sea trials. It showed that all the systems on board the U-boat were functioning properly, and the boat was ready to go into combat, or combat ready. And so they fixed that seal on it to show that it was ready to go. There is Captain Kuhlman, of course, shortly before his death on the deck of U-166. It was very interesting how they fitted these boats out. They were a combination of steel and wood, strangely. On the inside of the conning tower area, you had teak planking. And teak is a very, very hard wood, and strangely enough, U-166 today, after having spent 60 years on the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico, that teak planking is still there, hasn't rotted. And this is another important sort of footnote. U-166 sits at the bottom of what's called the Mississippi Canyon. And this is an area of the outer continental shelf that is eroded away by the water action of the Mississippi River as it flows from the heartland of the United States and flows out into the Gulf of Mexico. The current is so strong and in such an incredible amount of water. The volume of water cuts basically a big canyon through the outer continental shelf as it slopes off to the deeper water of the Gulf of Mexico. Now that canyon can be very, very deep, and U-166 and Robert E. Lee both sit at the bottom of the Mississippi Canyon. They sit in 5,000 feet of water. It's almost a mile deep. That's how deep the Gulf of Mexico can be. And just as an added footnote, that's not as deep as the Gulf of Mexico gets. The deepest spot in the Gulf of Mexico is a place called the Sigsbee Deep, and it's 12,000 feet deep. So, although the Gulf of Mexico around, for example, the Breton Sound, the Chandeleur Islands, and around the various bays in the western Gulf of Louisiana, although that water can be very, very shallow, don't let it fool you, because the Gulf gets very, very deep as well. Well, there's one great photograph of Captain Kuhlman on deck taking U-166 out of the Weser River. And it's important to discuss this and to remember this entire campaign for a number of reasons. It's important for this museum, for the D-Day Museum, to share collections like this with the public, because this is an element of World War II history that is largely overlooked. I mean, had any of you ever heard of this before? Before today, were you aware that 24 U-boats operated in the Gulf of Mexico, sinking 56 ships? It's now estimated that the Germans killed close to 600 Americans and Britons and Venezuelans and Russians, a whole host of American allies in the Gulf of Mexico during the war. 600 people killed. We sank 3 U-boats, killing barely 150 Germans. It's important that this campaign is remembered because it speaks volumes of how unprepared the United States was. This was at a time early in the immobilization of the United States after the declaration of war. Of course, after Pearl Harbor, the day after Pearl Harbor, on December 8, 1941, the United States declares war on Japan, but then by operation of a treaty that Germany, Japan, and Italy had all signed, Germany declared war on the United States on December 11, 1941. Now, in this early stage, the United States had a very small military. In 1941, the Japanese had the largest military in the world. The Germans had the second largest military in the world. The United States, 18th largest military in the world. Our military was smaller than Romania's. The United States was not ready to go to war with the number 1 and the number 2 big bad boys on the block. The United States wasn't ready for it. However, the United States had a wonderful capacity to produce war material, to produce thousands and thousands of aircraft, to produce thousands and thousands of tanks, millions of rifles, incredible quantities of ammunition. We had that capability, but it wasn't there yet. It took a lot of time for us to get spooled up. I give as an example Willow Run, which is right outside of Romulus, Michigan. Willow Run was a production plant that was established by Ford Motor Company during World War II. It was an assembly line for the B-24 Liberator bomber. This was a 4-engine bomber that could carry the heaviest bomb loads of any World War II bomber except for the B-29. Well, the B-24 was being produced by other companies. Ford Motor wanted to tool up an assembly line so that they could begin producing it as well. They laid the groundwork for a plant at Willow Run right outside of Detroit, and it took over a year and a half for this plant to be completed. When it was finished, it comprised over 1 million square feet of assembly area, of floor space on the plant. It had an assembly line itself that was over 1 mile long. Now, Willow Run during World War II would produce about 8,000 B-24 bombers. I'm using this just as an example, as an illustration to help you understand. When the United States finally mobilized our military and we mobilized our industry especially, we were capable of taking the German, Japanese, and Italian enemies on and meeting them. But in the early phase, throughout 1942 and into 1943, before mobilization had reached its full effect, we were very vulnerable. Nowhere is that more apparent than what happens in the Gulf of Mexico during the summer of 1942, while we were waiting for Willow Run. Strangely, Willow Run cost the government millions of dollars, and there was an incredible controversy over the amount of money that was being spent on this plant. We had to wait over a year and a half. There were some senators and congressmen that were very, very upset about the amount of money that was being spent on the Willow Run production facility, and they were also upset about how long it was taking for the first B-24 to roll off that assembly line. It took over a year and a half. Now, that's very illustrative of what happens in the U.S. It takes us a long time to get to the point where we can produce enough bombers. It takes us a long time to where we get to the point where we can produce enough ships. It takes us a long time to where we can produce enough rifles and submachine guns to put them in the hands of our men that we take overseas to defeat our enemies. And during that amount of time, during that first year or so of World War II, the United States was incredibly vulnerable. We needed every ship that we could get because we had not yet begun the mass production of Liberty ships and Victory ships and LSTs. We needed every last barrel of oil we could get our hands on because we had to expand this modern mechanized military force. We had to send tanks and aircraft overseas to defeat the enemy. The last thing we needed was every ship coming off the Mississippi River being sunk. The last thing we needed was every barrel of oil coming from the rich oil fields of Texas and Louisiana. The last thing we needed was to have all of them going off like a funeral pyre in the Gulf of Mexico. So during this vulnerable period, during the first year or so of the Second World War, the last thing we could stand was an outright U-boat campaign led by people like Hans Kuhlman. The last thing that we could handle was 24 U-boats in our backyard sinking all of our ships, carrying all of our oil. During this very vulnerable period, the United States was sorely prepared to meet the threat. In fact, like I mentioned earlier, the German U-boat campaign, it lasted 14 months. Some sinkings continued into the latter stages of 1942 and then into 1943. But during that phase, it was largely over. The Germans moved in, sank 56 ships, and for the most part, they pulled back out. After 1943, after January 1st, 1943, the United States started to get the first combat warships in the Gulf. We started to have destroyers that could escort ships in and out of Gulf waters. We started to get our first warplanes that could fly anti-submarine warfare patrols. We even started basing aircraft at places like St. Thomas in the U.S. Virgin Islands, and Cuba, and South Florida. We had aircraft that could fly patrols all over the Caribbean and also the Gulf of Mexico. But we didn't really get that until 1943, when it was too late. By then, the Germans had largely just pulled out of their campaign in the Gulf of Mexico, and they began using those U-boats to sink ships in the North Atlantic, where we were also vulnerable, where ships were carrying men and supplies across the Atlantic to support our British and our Soviet allies. So when the Germans struck in the Gulf of Mexico, they struck hard and they struck effectively. This is one of the last shots of U-166 as it was leaving Germany to deploy to occupied France. The captain probably took this. This is looking toward the stern of the U-boat. And in the background, you can't really make it out in this photograph, but in the background you can make out coastline. One of the last photos taken, and you can see the flag with swastika there. And then this photograph, which we believe was the last photograph taken of U-166 before its ultimate destruction. This photograph was taken at Wesermunde, right off the coast of Germany, right before it submerged to proceed to its occupying base in Lorient in occupied France. Well, U-166 was just one of hundreds of U-boats that operated during World War II. And the story of U-boat operations in World War II is very interesting because in the early phases, the U-boats were incredibly effective. Probably the best example of that is the U-boat campaign in the Gulf of Mexico, where the Germans sink more ships than they get sunk. They're very effective in sinking ships and destroying property and blowing up strategic value, things of great strategic value like oil or bauxite or iron ore. They destroy that stuff, and at a time when we're not prepared to deal with them. However, after 1943, the tide turned for the U-boat during World War II. What began happening after that is that the U-boats began to get destroyed wholesale. And the reason for that was the development of a couple of technological advances, things like radar and sonar, where they had already been developed, but they were being perfected to the point where they could work effectively against U-boats. Now in 43, 44, and into 45, it was possible for patrol aircraft with radar. They could have this look-down capability with radar where they could patrol in the air during daylight hours and projecting radar beams everywhere. And they could pick up a U-boat running on the surface, and they could move toward that target. Now, they were also able to develop weapons that could effectively sink U-boats and destroy things that were either on the surface or submerged. So later in World War II, the U-boat was more vulnerable than it was effective. However, in the early phase, where we were still waiting for the full development of our mobilization, where we were still waiting to develop from the 18th largest military in the world to a 15 million man citizen soldier army, women too, I should mention. While we were still waiting for that, when the Germans were still capable of operating effectively using this incredibly effective tool, we weren't ready for them. We were vulnerable to them. And during World War II, the Germans did not have but one single strategic weapon, and it was the U-boat. The U-boat, which came close to starving the British out during the early phase before the United States got involved in late 1941. The U-boat, which just about crippled us as we sent ships down the Mississippi River only to get sunk during the summer of 1942. So this weapon that was oh so effective was not used to its full potential, and that was the responsibility and fault of one person and one person only, Adolf Hitler. In the pre-war period, he had been approached by the head of the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine. His name was Karl Dönitz. Dönitz asked Hitler for a U-boat fleet of 250 operational Type 9 U-boats, long-range U-boats like U-166, U-boats capable of sailing all the way across the Atlantic, operating for over a month in enemy waters, and then coming back to occupied territory. And Adolf Hitler told him no and cut the fleet in half. When Dönitz wanted to send U-boats to the Gulf of Mexico, he wanted as many as 50. Hitler said, no, we can send just a few at a time, and limited the involvement of the U-boats in the Gulf of Mexico. The result of that was, because of Hitler's meddling, the U-boat was not used to its full potential. And in this early stage, in 42 and early 43, when the United States was especially vulnerable to the strategic weapon that was the U-boat, Hitler limited him. Hitler, who has at times made such foolish and irrational decisions, that he actually helped us. At a time when he could have struck the United States, struck hard, and seriously limited our ability to make war, he chose to limit the way that the Navy was using its U-boats. And the result was we ultimately mobilized our industry, we ultimately mobilized our military, sent military overseas, and defeated them. But it was almost during 1942 in the summer when the U-boats almost defeated us here in the Gulf of Mexico, in our own backyards, in Louisiana territorial waters. Well, thank you for your attention. I appreciate you sticking around and listening. And if you have any questions, please come see me afterwards. I'd be happy to talk to you about it.